Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Raw Talk. I'm Joshua Cripps, and in this series, I'm going to guide you through my processing of photos that I take during my photography expedition. So this morning, I'm going to walk you through the process that I'm going to use to create an HDR panorama of a full moon shoot here in the Eastern Sierra. And if you haven't seen that vlog, we'll link it up here somewhere. So go ahead and check that out first to see how I actually shot the image. And then I'm going to walk you through the processing of it right now. So let's go ahead and jump into Lightroom. The first thing I've done is I have gone through all of my images and I've decided on the photos that I want to blend to a panorama. Now, normally, if there was enough dynamic range in the scene, or if the dynamic range was small enough to be capturable by the camera, I wouldn't shoot an HDR bracket. But in this particular case, because I had a very, very bright moon and pretty dark shadows in the mountains, I needed to span a little bit more of that dynamic range. So this is why I have shot a 3 exposure burst for each particular panel of this panorama. So ranging from a 25th of a second all the way up to 0.6 seconds. So that is a 2-stop bracket. So a 25th, a 6th, and then 0.6. So actually a 4-stop bracket in that particular case. And I shot a huge wide pano, but for the purposes of this video, I am just going to show you a smaller section, basically right around the moon, making kind of like a big, fat, chunky 4x5-ish kind of crop. So once I've gone through and selected all the photos, you can see I've got those bracketing bursts for each individual part of the panorama. I'm going to simply go through. You can see how some of them have a little bit of vignetting. Now, a lot of times when you do the merge to panorama in Lightroom and Photoshop, it figures out, it gets rid of the vignetting on its own, but you can always help it along its way a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead into the lens corrections here. I'm going to ensure chromatic aberration is ticked. And then under the manual corrections, I'm just going to remove a little bit of that vignetting. Now, sometimes it's hard to see when the image is full size like this. So if you shrink it down, it makes those transitions easier to see. So in this case, if I make this nice and small, you could see I do have some vignetting there in the corners. I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit. You don't have to go crazy overboard. You don't have to stress yourself out trying to make this perfect, because again, Lightroom will do its best to figure out, do you have vignetting? And try to remove it. Yeah, okay. So we're just going to start with that, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to apply it to every single one of these other photos that go in my panel here. So I'm just going to sync settings, check all. I haven't done anything else except make sure that chromatic aberration and that vignetting is done. So this should just fly through there. Perfect. Now that I've got all of these selected from start to finish, I'm going to go ahead and right click on them and hit Photo Merge HDR Panorama. Now, it's really important if you're shooting a moon panorama with bracketing that your shots are happening as quickly as possible, because the moon is going to be moving during that time. And the more that the moon moves, the harder it's going to be for your computer to figure out which is the right place. You know, if the moon's moving, you might get haloing or overlap and kind of weird ghosting effects. Now, probably we're going to have some of that anyway, but I will show you how you might be able to deal with that after the fact. Okay, great. So we've done our initial panorama stitch. It looks really good. I've got this big fat photo now. I'm sure it's going to be incredibly detailed. Because this scene doesn't have any particularly straight lines that I'm absolutely concerned about, like a horizon, I'm not too worried about the boundary warp here. I also did a really good job making sure my tripod was level, so I don't have a lot of distortion in the frame, but I'm just going to slide that boundary warp up to 100 just to fill the frame in like this. Now for me, I never use the auto settings, auto crop. I want to go ahead and manually make those choices after the fact. So I'm just going to hit merge here, and it's going to do its thing. Waiting for the computer to do its thing. Okay, it is done. It has done its thing. Fantastic. So let me go ahead and take a look at this panel here. And I always start off any edit just by identifying what do I need to do? What did I like about the scene? What do I want to bring out? So in this particular morning, I have another panel where there was beautiful warm red light across the mountains, and it's lovely. But in this case, I wanted to process a little bit more of that subtle scene. However, you can see there is still some warm light, some pre-dawn warm light hitting the tips of the mountains. That's very lovely. So I'd like to bring out the contrast between that warm light, the cooler light of the shadows. Of course, I want to bring more detail into the moon, and maybe I can bring a little bit of contrast into these hills in the middle so they're not quite so uniform. I also have these big, ugly towers. If you saw the vlog, you know why I have those towers. They just happen to be right in the alignment from the place that I needed to stand. Now, probably I could have gotten away if I'd walked to the other side of them and shot from the other side. It would have put the moon in a slightly different alignment. In retrospect, I wish I had done that, but I wasn't sure what the timing of the sunrise would be. So in this particular case, I have these ugly towers here. In a perfect world, I would get rid of them, but it's going to be a lot of painstaking work, and it's probably going to produce a pretty messy result. So the honest answer to this is go back another time, shoot it where you don't have those towers in the way. Now, if you are stuck with an image like this and you absolutely want to print it or do something, what I would recommend, don't go through and try to clean up all of these individual towers here. It's going to be an absolute mess. If you're desperate to clean that sort of thing up in an image that you have, I would recommend hiring somebody to do it. Go on Upwork or go on Fiverr and find a Photoshop retouching expert who can do a better job than you can. And it'll just cost you, $20, $50, something like that, depending on how long it takes. And you're going to save yourself from pulling your hair out with all that headache. Okay. So anyway, let's go where I'm going to bring this into the develop module. That's where I want to be. Fantastic. Okay. So let's start here. What am I going to do? So bearing those things in mind, we can start doing some processing here. The first thing that I'm going to do is come down here to my calibration tab, and I'm going to start playing with my primary channels. And this is a cool little thing because it actually affects all of the different pixels in your photo. What I love about playing with the blue channel is it tends to make the blue tones a bit darker and the warmer tones, the reds and yellows, a bit brighter. So this is something that can automatically bring a bit more depth and dimension. And you see as I do this, as I slide that blue primary up, it's already starting to separate out sort of these warmer tones in the mountains from the cooler shadows from the warmer tones of those hills in the midground. So I'm just going to slide those up a little bit. I'm going to play with some of these other channels too, just to see what it does. Okay. So sliding the green saturation up, really interesting. It's actually making it more blue and purple, and I kind of like that look. So I'm going to go with something like that. Let me try playing with the red saturation too. You know what? I kind of reducing the effect of making those blue tones a bit darker. So I'm going to leave that one alone. Okay, fantastic. So let's go ahead, and as I look at the overall image here, it feels just a little bit too cool to me, especially if I want to bring out some of those warm tones. So I'm going to just increase the white balance a little bit here. Let me just drag this up until it feels a little bit more balanced between the warm tones and the cool tones. Yeah, maybe something like that. Of course, we can always tweak this later as we need to. And let's start with that and see how we go from there. Okay. So I'm going to just begin. I know I'm going to do quite a lot of local adjustments on this image to bring out exactly what I want. So I'm going to start with a couple of global adjustments just to get to a place that I like, and then I'm going to go from there. So let me hide that by hitting I on my keyboard to get rid of that information. You can always bring it back by hitting I again. It tells you all kinds of cool things like when you shot the photo, the raw dimension size. You can see this is huge. It's basically a medium format. This is about 100 megapixel image at this point. And if I zoom in, yeah, sure enough, you can see the detail of that is incredible. So anyway, let me hide that again. All right, so let me start just by pulling down my highlights a bit here. Try to bring in a little more detail into the moon, although I'm going to do some local adjustments later. I'll pull up the shadows a little bit because my next move is going to be to add a little bit of global contrast to the image. So let me just grab my tone curve here. We're going to pull our highlights up, our shadows down, just to bring in that global contrast to the image. And we're already starting to get a nice separation between the warm tones and the cool tones. Now, as I do this, you can see that overall it's making the saturation of the image a bit stronger, and it's showing me that it's still quite cool. So I think I am going to bump up my my warmth a little bit, and it's starting to look a little bit purple now. So I think I'll slide my tint slider down just a little bit so I get a little bit more overall neutral color tone. Okay, that's looking pretty good to me. What else can we do to try to add a little more contrast to this thing? Okay, yes. So if I want to make the image a little more luminous while maintaining contrast, instead of increasing my exposure slider, which brightens everything up, I can just increase my white slider a little bit. Now, normally you'd want to be careful of blowing out things like the moon, but I'm going to go ahead and make a local adjustment to pull back the details of the moon. So in this particular case, honestly, I'm not that worried about it. Okay, now let's go ahead and why don't we add a little bit of saturation just to see what that's looking like. Yeah, that's looking pretty nice, actually. I think we can do a little bit more work with the top of the mountain and those hills as well in the midground, but I think as a starting point, this is looking pretty good. Alrighty, and one last thing I do before I get into a lot of local adjustments is I just want to try to bring out some of the detail here in the mountains. So I'm going to go down to my detail tab. I'm going to slide that sharpening all the way up, and then I'm going to just play with my radius here until I see something that really makes the details of the mountains look quite good. I was shooting from far, far, far away, and I could actually see the atmospheric ripples through my camera as I was photographing this scene. So I'm not expecting it to be razor sharp, but this looks pretty good, actually. I'm pretty happy with this for being 20 or so miles away from the mountains. The details look really nice. Alrighty. And then I don't need to sharpen the sky, so I'm going to hold my masking and just reduce that right there. I also saw I've got a couple of dust spots here. So I'm just going to hit Q on my keyboard and hit the A key. That allows me to then visualize the spots. And I'll just clean up some of those sensor spots. Like that. Fantastic. Oh, I got a massive sensor spot right there. Let me get rid of that. Just kidding. So I think this is looking pretty good. At this point, I want to do a little bit more local work to bring out the individual parts of the image. So let me go ahead and hit up the masking panel here. You can hit that Shift W on your keyboard or the little button up here in the corner. So, okay, first thing I want to do, I want to add a little bit more warmth to these mountains, right? And there's a really great tool for this. The color range tool in Lightroom is fantastic for making individual color selections. So if I come in here and I draw like a little box over this part of the mountains, just the part that I want to select, I'll zoom back out there. You can see this is what a color selection looks like. So everything that's dark here is not selected. Everything that is colored is selected. And I can further refine that with this slider. I can add and subtract different colors by using the Shift click or Alt/Option click. But I just want to add warmth to the top of the mountain. So I'm going to pull that down, that refinement down, until I'm selecting more or less just the top of the mountain, and it's fading out as it goes down. All right, so that looks really good. And what do I want to do? I want to add more warmth and color to it. So I'm just going to slide my color slider up, maybe add a little magenta to it as well, and some saturation. Perfect. And that's fading out as it goes down across the image. Let's maybe reduce the strength of that adjustment a touch. And if you want to fade it out even more, of course, you could, say, subtract off a linear gradient and you just blend it in a bit more like that. So now you can really have this refined adjustment that starts at the top and blends in across the bottom there. Okay, so let's turn that on and off. You can see, yes, that's a very nice effect of bringing in some additional warmth there to the top of the mountains. I think some of these shadows down here are a little bit too cyan and a little bit too saturated. So I am going to simply grab let's call this, I always like to name my masks. We're going to call this mountain top warmth. And I like to name them the effect that I'm doing. Beautiful. So let's go ahead and add another mask now. This is going to do a brush tool, and I'm going to brush over these areas. Okay. And right now I'm just making a selection. Okay. And within that selection, I'm going to go down here to my point color, and I'm going to make a sample of these blues that I think are a little bit too intense. So I have the option of shifting their hue, right? As well as their saturation. So I can be quite refined, and this is just going to occur now wherever I painted with that brush. And if it's getting to be a little bit too unrefined, I can drag this range down, something like that. So what does that look like? We're just reducing the blues. Yeah, that looks a bit better. I am going to take off auto mask for sure. I think I want to add a little bit back in there. So let me erase there, and I'll take that brush again and I'll paint that over all the spots where I think those blues are just a little bit too intense, like that. Okay, so those are a little bit more subtle, a little less saturated now. Okay, fantastic. So that's going to be blue shadow desaturation. Sure, we'll call it desati. Why not? A last little local thing I want to do, I want to bring those details back in my moon, and then we're going to send this over to Photoshop for some final adjustments in there. So I'm going to create a new mask. In this case, because the moon is so isolated by itself up in the sky, the object selector is going to work great. So I could just paint around the periphery of the moon like that. It'll truck away, and boom, just like that, voila, I've got a moon selected. So how can I bring in the details of the moon? I like to do that here in the tone panel to start. I can pull down the highlights, right? I can pull down the exposure. I really start to see the details of the moon there. And I can also add some, I can fart around in the curve. I can bring the darker parts of the moon darker while leaving the brighter parts bright, so I maintain that contrast. You can add some texture and clarity if you really want to try to bring out the details, but I don't want to go overdone, because if I zoom out now, you'll see it starts to look a little weird, it starts to look a little fake. I've introduced some dark fringing around the edges. I've got this red fringe on the left-hand side there. That's from the imperfect HDR blend, and that's something we're going to clean up in Photoshop. But this dark fringe that come in from reducing the exposure, I can actually reduce that. I can clean that up very easily here in Lightroom. So I'm going to subtract off a color range, and I'm going to select the blue right next to the moon. So that is going to allow those adjustments to fade out as they go to the edge of the moon. The other thing I want to do with that moon is I'm not particularly fond of that color. I think that yellow looks a little funky. So here in the color panel, I'm just going to cool it down. I'm going to desaturate it a little bit, and I'm going to cool it down. Maybe add a little magenta so it sort of matches the color of the mountains there. Alrighty. Yeah, that looks better. I like the way that's looking. And then let's go ahead and turn that on and off. Yeah, all that detail we brought back into the moon. Great. You know what? Maybe I want to add a little more depth to that sky, a little more depth of color. So we're going to call this one Moon Detail. Okay. And then, boy, I cannot type for the life of me today, especially when caps lock is on. Let's do one more new mask. We're going to select the sky here. Let's see what it does. Okay, it's flowed over the mountains a little bit. So I can try to refine that by intersecting it with another sky selection, and that should tighten that up a little bit. Perfect. Let's see what happens as I add a little bit of blue. Yeah, okay, beautiful. That's nice. That's not doing too much dramatic overspill onto the mountains. Let's try turning that on and off. Yes, beautiful. That's really helping the warm tones of the mountains and creating this wonderful layering effect across the image. Excellent. So we're going to call this Sky Color. At this point, we can call this pretty much good here in Lightroom. What I want to do now is bring this over to Photoshop to clean up that edge of the moon, as well as add a little bit more contrast down here in the hills, because the selection tools in Photoshop are just a little bit more refined. So I'm going to right-click, edit in, open as a smart object, Photoshop. Here it is. Okay, so first things first, let's go ahead and clean up that goofy-looking moon edge up there. I'm going to show you just one technique. There are many ways to do this, but here's one that I like to do that adds a little bit of an extra glow to the moon as well. So I'm going to start by going over here to my selection tools, and I'm going to find the object selection tool. Okay. So I'm going to just do a little thing like this, a little marquee over the moon. It's going to churn away and it's going to go, hey, look, you got a moon right there. I sure do. That's fantastic. So now that I've got the moon selected, I'm going to make sure that I'm on this layer, which is the only layer. That's great. And I'm going to hit Control or Command J. That's going to duplicate just my moon. So I could take that thing now and I can make it bigger, can make it smaller. In this case, what I want to do is I just want to make it a teeny tiny little bit bigger, just to the point that it's going to be larger than that furrowed edge there. So something like that. Perfect. And then the next step is I am going to blur this layer out. So let me go to Blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it just to the point that that fringe starts to disappear. Now, you're always going to have a little bit of discoloration along the edge of the moon, so don't stress about this too much. All right, but we can at least get rid of that hard, blocky looking edge that comes from that poor misalignment. Okay, so now that I've got this blurred moon, I'm going to add a layer mask by holding Alt or Option and click on the layer mask button. That's going to turn that invisible. You can see there's that funky edge I want to get rid of. So now I'm just going to take a brush tool with a high opacity, 100%, and very, very soft. And I'm just going to blend in along the edge here my sort of blurred out moon. Okay, and I'm going to be really careful about doing this. In this part, I can do it without a lot of care. But when I get around the backside of the moon, then I want to be a little more careful about how I do that. So I'm just blending this in, trying to get that rough looking edge to go away. Okay, you can go down to a lower opacity and start to blend in again a little bit more. Just trying to like make that a nice soft blend around the edge. There we go, a little bit too much right there. Whoops. Okay, let's put that in. That looks pretty good. Let's do a little more right there. Beautiful. So I've got this nice kind of glowy edge around the moon. And you can also, if you want to add a little bit more glow, you could say put a curves adjustment and clip it to that layer by holding Alt or Option and clicking in between there. And then I can drag up the brightness of just that layer. It's going to make the outside edge of that moon a little brighter. Just kind of make it look a little bit glowier as well. Okay, I need to do a little bit more cleanup right in this area. Just subtly blend that in. All right, super duper. So let's go back to 100%. That looks great. Let's turn this on and off. You can see the effect that has. Really just softens out the edge of the moon, helps it blend into the sky a little bit more, and gets rid of that funky, funky looking edge. All right, perfect. Now that our moon is taken care of, the last thing that I want to do is add a little bit of contrast to these hills. And I'm going to do that via creating a color mask. So I'm going to click on this bottom layer, then go to my channels, and I'm going to click through until I see which of these particular layers, red, green, or blue, has the most contrast between those hills and the surrounding mountains. And it's the blue channel by far. So I'm going to go ahead and Control Command click on that. You can also click this little button down here. That makes a selection of that channel. Then click on this little button, which saves that selection as another channel. So this alpha channel, I'm going to double click on it and I'm going to rename it Hills. Now at this point, this mask, it's not particularly targeted to those hills, so I got to work it a little bit more. So making sure I'm on that Hills channel, I'm going to hit Control Command M. It's going to bring up my curves adjustment. Now I can actually just look on this image and I want to make as big a separation, as clean a separation between these hills and the surrounding mountains as I possibly can. So grab this little hand tool, see where the mountains lie on the tone curve. They're about down there. I want to make that super bright. The curves are just below them. So I'm going to pull this line all the way up like this, my white point all the way up, and then I'm going to pull my black point all the way up like that as well until I have a super stark separation between the hills and the mountains. Beautiful, like that. And if there's a little bit of overspill, it's actually just fine. I am not too worried about that at all. Cool. So at this point, I have a pretty clean mask. I could go in and refine this a little bit more if I needed to, but I think I'm going to work with this as is and just see how it goes. So if you know masking in Adobe products, you know that whatever is white is selected and whatever is dark is deselected. So that's the opposite of what I have here. I need to invert this mask. So you can do that by hitting Control or Command I. Thunk. And now I have the hills in beautiful vivid white and the mountains overall are quite dark. There's a few little speckles of white through there. If it becomes a problem as I make an adjustment, I can go back and select and adjust this mask. So to turn this channel now into a selection, I can either Control or Command click on the thumbnail or click the little button down here in the channels palette. You'll see that brings the marching ants up. Then I'm going to click back on my RGB, go back to my layers, and I'm going to simply add on top of that layer a curves layer. And it's going to create a curves layer that is by default filled with the mask that I just created. Beautiful. And if I click on the histogram, on the actual curves properties, you can see that it's only got data in this lower part of the range, which makes sense. It corresponds to what's going on here in the hills. So to add contrast here, I'm going to grab this little hand tool, which allows me to click and drag on the image to create control points on the curve. And I'm going to find sort of a brighter part of the hills that I want to be a little bit brighter, like maybe in this range right here. So I can pull those up. And you can see as I do this, all of those hills are getting brighter, but it's not selecting the mountains in the background because I took that care to make that really precise mask. So now let me go to a darker part of the hills, maybe something in the shadowy area right down here, and I can click and drag down. Alrighty. So now I've got this little S curve forming up on my curve here that corresponds just to the hills and the grasses down below. And as I adjust it more up and down, you can see it really does create a lot of extra contrast in those hills. And it turns out I didn't have to worry about those little micro speckle selections in the mountains. I'm not really seeing an effect of this. So let me turn that on and off, and you can see the effect, how much contrast that brings into those hills. Makes a huge difference. Really adds a little bit of extra depth and dimension to them. So if you find when you do this, when you add a curves adjustment in Photoshop, that it makes your colors way too saturated, you can see how it really brought out a lot of the purples here. Now, I don't mind in this particular case, but sometimes it gets a little bit too intense. You can change the blending mode of this layer to luminosity, and it will only affect the luminance values. So making sure I'm working on that curves 2 layer in my layers palette, I'm going to go up here to the blending mode options and change it from normal down here to luminosity. And you can see it got rid of all of that extra color information, and it just added a luminance change. So I'm adding contrast without saturation. If I turn that on and off, you can see it brings out all of the details of the hills without making them super purple, which is really nice because it allows the colors of the mountains to shine through a little bit stronger. So I think this image is looking really good now. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And again, I'm not going to worry about trying to clean up those pylons. That is a huge amount of painstaking work. You're better off shooting a scene like this another time where those aren't in the middle of your frame. Or I should have gone on the other side of them. It turns out in the end, the timing would have worked out fine. I just wasn't sure in the moment. So that's what we started with, our basic HDR panoramic merge. And through a little bit of massaging, we ended up with an image like that, which really represents much more closely the beauty of the morning, all the richness and the subtlety of the colors, and of course, the beautiful, wonderful detail of the moon. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Raw Talk. For more post-processing tutorials and fantastic walkthroughs from some of today's best landscape photographers, be sure to check out the Nature Photography Collective. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.